Hi everyone, welcome to the new episode of the Prime View. I'm Dana Kohut, your host. In this interview episode, we had the pleasure to sit with John Egan, who is co-founder of Kintaba, a startup company that built a robust incident management tool. In this interview episode, we talked about how incident management can be integrated into the product release process. What are the common misconceptions that many companies have about incident management, and how larger companies like Facebook, Netflix, or Google approach to incident management comparing to smaller or mid-sized companies. It's a great interview, and I believe you will learn a lot from it. So don't forget to subscribe to the Prime View YouTube channel. Stay tuned. Hi, John. Welcome to the Prime View. Yeah, thank you for taking the time to join me today. And my first question to you is about your professional background. I know that Kintaba is not the first startup that you have founded. Also, you've been working at Facebook for over 6 years, and now you are co-founder of another great startup, Kintaba. Tell us a little bit more about your professional trajectory and the steps that you have taken in your career that led you to your current position.
Yeah, so I think at my core, I'm a founder a little bit more than an employee. In fact, if you traced me backwards a little bit, before I went to Facebook, I actually owned a company that was funded by Y Combinator back in 2011. Back in the old days of startup building, and we were doing high-speed data transport at the time. So primarily interested in the media industry back when moving terabytes of data around the world was a sort of emerging technology as opposed to a standard, I think, that it is today. And that company only really existed for about 18 months. It was a very quick trajectory. And Facebook showed up and bought us as they were rapidly scaling, and we recognized the rocket ship that company was. So it was a very, very natural move for us. But the primary reason for that acquisition was Facebook was at about 4,000 people, I think, at the time, and was scaling up and expecting to get up to 20, 30,000 people, that it is today. And they had a really interesting challenge emerging internally around how do we build all these tools that are going to support this company as it grows. And there were a series of engineering teams working on tools. I'm not going to get all their names right, but there was one called X Tools. I think there was a Dev Tools team. And they were merging internally into another team called Info Tools. Or sorry, not merging, but they were starting a team called Info Tools. And that team was really focused on how are we going to make information available throughout the organization as it scaled past the point where you could just, friend someone on Facebook and share it. At the time, and it might even still be true, you could only friend 5,000 people at Facebook. So the company was actually reaching a limit where you couldn't actually friend everyone inside the company anymore. So it was really exciting for us. I mean, that was a huge career opportunity, I think, for me, going from the really excitement of sort of lean startup building that we were in into this totally different world of a well-funded unicorn, and how do we support it as it grows? And we got to build everything there. And when I say we, I mean me and my co-founder at the time, who was Zach, who's also a co-founder in this company. And we built everything from recruiting tools to internal messaging tools to profile information for internal employees to visitor tools, and ultimately went on to actually build an external tool, which is Facebook Workplace, which we built primarily out in London, and became one of Facebook's first real enterprise offering, outside of just the ads industry. And it was a really exciting time to build. We got to work with a lot of really fantastic product leaders there. And I worked there for a solid, 5 or 6 years, kind of building all of these products up, and had a chance to work in Menlo Park, California, in London, in the UK, and then ultimately here in New York, where I am now. And, at the end of it, leaving eventually and going back to doing another startup really didn't feel like making this transition, away from Facebook. It just felt like, okay, this is the next step. Let's go back and build another company, and let's sort of progress forward there. And working in the tools space certainly made sense. For a bit addicted to infrastructure and tools products. And I could tell you a little bit more about Kintaba as we go into this conversation. But that, as far as a background, and a trajectory to me, I think sometimes folks will look at my LinkedIn profile and they'll say, "Oh, these are big switches," but it all felt very natural. From a progression from a very lean startup to working for a major unicorn at the time, to going back and building tools that kind of propagate out what we learned at that unicorn, outwards to other organizations.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story, a fascinating career path that you have taken. Interesting. Well, what does Kintaba mean? And how do you define Kintaba as a business?
So Kintaba, the name, I guess I'll start there and work
Yeah.
forward, actually comes from a Japanese art form called kintsugi, which is also a philosophy. And it's the art form is taking broken pottery and reassembling it by using golden inlay where the cracks were. And your end result actually becomes more valuable. So this art form is the reassembled piece of pottery or other artwork actually is more valuable than it was before it was destroyed and reassembled. And it's this wonderful metaphor into this movement that's happening now throughout the valley and tech and really all companies, I think, around resiliency, which is this core shift within organizations of hiding breakages and trying to prevent or get all of our numbers down and say we break less, not more, and actually go the other direction and say, no, breakages happen all the time. How do we respond really well to them internally? And how do we actually become more valuable as an organization because of those failures? And so Kintaba is taking this direction that we've seen really successfully work at companies like Facebook, Google, and Netflix, which is embracing outages, defining a process around how they're dealt with, such that each one that happens is really a black swan event. So when I think about what Kintaba is for other organizations, it's really your off-the-shelf software solution to implement these best practices rather than what a lot of companies do today, which is they go hire a consultant and they drag everyone into a conference room and they say, okay, in the next 3 hours, we're all going to learn how to be better, about managing major incidents. And there's sort of that natural progression, right? Things start as kind of consultancies and then they eventually grow into kind of company culture. And then long term, if you really want to implement process that survives the life of your organization, it has to be a tool. So Kintaba strives to be that tool. It's everything from where you declare your incidents, where folks inside your organization can come to see what the current incidents are, the collaborative platform on top of which you go and manage and mitigate those incidents and bring together the responders, and then also the post-mortem and learning process after the incident is closed. So it's all of that in one product suite that any company can implement and use.
Interesting. What would you define as the main challenges for a startup working in the incident management area?
So I think incident management is actually pretty poorly defined in a lot of cases. It's had a lot of meanings in the past. I think even 10 years ago, incident management for most companies just meant routing an alert, right, from a monitoring system to a sleeping SRE to wake up and deal with the problem. And it's really evolved over the last 5-6 years, especially after Google published their SRE handbook, which really sort of laid out how they internally deal with these incidents as across the organization, not just within the SRE teams. And so it becomes an interesting challenge for a lot of companies that are kind of just taking these first steps in terms of, well, where are we implementing this? Are these practices something that we have a 5-person team that deals with? Is this something the product and engineering teams care about? Do we have PR involved? Is legal in these conversations? Like who is involved? And we really take the stance at Kintaba that the whole organization should be part of this process. If you have an outage, it affects everyone from your sales organization to your customer success teams to your PR teams, and outwards, and everyone should have access to the information about what's going on. And that's actually a pretty new idea. I think it's easy for us all to kind of hop into calls and we all say, yeah, that's definitely something we should do. But the implementation of that's pretty difficult. You have a lot of siloed teams, especially inside of engineering and SRE. Inside of organizations. And those teams don't always even live under the same umbrella. Sometimes they're in IT, sometimes they're in engineering, sometimes they're in product. And what Kintaba really is trying to do is say, this is simpler than going in and having to do a large scale enterprise implementation to have this awareness and openness. You can just put this product in and give people access. And it should work, right? Just like out of the gate, it should work. Anyone should be able to declare. And that's a hard pill to swallow, I think, for organizations that aren't either hiring directly out of Facebook or Google and absorbing employees that are accustomed to it. So what we're really finding as we build this product out is initially we thought, okay, this is really just about the tooling. Let's make sure we get the tools in place and people can adopt them and implement them directly. And it's really turning out to be all about the onboarding. How do you go from we don't practice what I'd call sort of resiliency best practices yet to we practice them now without forcing people to go read training documentation and forcing people to go and read Sidney Decker's books and read whatever the most recently published book is from Google. Like the product has to explain all of that. And it's a big learning over the last year. So a lot of our pilot customers were already really philosophically aligned with this direction. But as we kind of move forward as a company, right, it's all about more and more companies that are just taking those first steps. So those are really our challenges, I think, as a business. And I think if you look across kind of the range of organizations trying to do this, you see a lot of them, kind of almost shying away from that. They're what you maybe say in the VC world, moving up market, right? They're just going after bigger and bigger enterprises so they can justify the effort that it takes to go into it. And we really have an opposing view. We really believe this should be self-service. Anyone in the company should be able to adopt it. It shouldn't be something that has to be made at an executive level to go into an implementation. And that's, I think, the uniqueness of Kintaba as a product.
Yeah, John, I would be really keen to know what are the common things that companies take wrong about incident management.
So I hate to say wrong. It's always a little bit of a negative approach, but I think things that can be improved, in a lot of companies, one of which is really this base application of the process to every incident that happens. So a lot of organizations really draw the line for an incident to say, okay, it's not really an incident until the site is down, until no one can access the page, until it's so bad that an executive noticed and sent an email, and then it became an incident, right? And really what we want to do when we're establishing a process like this is lower the barrier to creating incidents. We want to say, look, you really want to be filing these Sev1s that you're probably already aware of, right? These like absolute critical cases, but you also really want to capture these, what we call Sev2s, Sev3s, near misses. You want to say, look, if there was something that affected a small group of customers, but there's still learnings to be gathered from, you really ought to go through the process. You ought to declare the incident, you ought to record the mitigation process, and you ought to write your little postmortem document. And it's really difficult to go from a world where you're only documenting the Sev1s because it's okay to have a really beefy and difficult and long process around that, right? It's justified for the amount of damage that was potentially done from the incident. It's really tough for an organization to go from that to saying, okay, we're also going to document our Sev3s that maybe only lasted for 5 minutes, and we really only need to write like a 5-sentence postmortem about this thing, right? It's basically like never do a deployment with this command again, right? Like different little things like that. And encouraging that is difficult inside of most organizations. And it's what most organizations, I suppose I could say get wrong, is they shy away from recording those incidents or putting them through the process. And they say, well, they're not big enough. And I think when you look at companies like a Facebook and like a Google, you can actually map this even back to like the airline industry and like the space industry. The reason these companies or industries are so resilient and are so safe compared to everything else, I think the airline industry, what they ferried like 8 billion passengers over the last 12 years, and there hasn't been a fatal crash, right? It's unbelievable. And the reason is because they implemented this aggressive reporting requirement of Sev2s and Sev3s, what we'd call in the tech industry, right? Record everything. And they created that culture where pilots knew that by recording things that weren't, terminal in terms of their criticality, that it was going to be used to make things safer long-term. They trusted that, not that it was going to be used for regulatory fines or punitive measures internally as an engineering org. So that's pretty hard for companies, is let's get out of this mode of, treating incidents as a reason to fire people. Let's get people into this mode of filing an incident is actually something to be celebrated, and you should probably be rewarded for. It should probably be one of the metrics that they look at the end of the quarter or the half, whatever your review cycle is. Like all of those things should be done. And it's a big cultural shift, and cultural shifts are hard. Products are the best way to go and implement them, but they can be tough for organizations to absorb, especially if it's a little bit different from the way they were working, a year ago and perceived to be successful within the company.
Yeah, what are the companies that are willing to adopt an incident management tool in order to improve their work?
Yeah, so our early adopters really are the companies that are kind of absorbing employees from these organizations that are already practicing this well, right? The Valley is very much shares its employees around. You have Facebook constantly feeding out new employees. Google's doing this. And so when you look at, sort of our banner customer list, folks like Gusto, folks like Canix, folks like Vercel, a lot of these organizations really have it in their DNA. And for them to come in and adopt a product like Kintaba is a very natural action, right? They're already practicing this or trying to, and they need tools to come in and make it easier and easier over time, and to continue to iterate forward. So that's really the kind of company that comes in and adopts us right out of the gate. We kind of call these, unicorns and ascending unicorns, right? You have this transformation, I suppose, from the horse to the unicorn, and a lot of these folks are in that position. Gusto for sure, Vercel's another fantastic example, right? These companies are buying into resiliency practices when they're reasonably small, by long-term measures, and they're going to carry them forward, for the 10,000, 20,000 people, just like companies like Google and Facebook did. I think Vercel, when they adopted us originally, was like 30 people. It's a very small company at the time, and I'm sure they're doubling year over year at this point. And so it's just a wonderful, group to start with. And I think that you kind of get these nice follow-on actions from companies like that, right? Then every other startup looks at this and says, well, I want to be a Gusto. I want to be a Vercel. What are they doing right? And we really want to be part of that tool stack. So when we look at companies we work with today, as we're kind of moving into this year and beyond, we're looking more and more at the companies that aspire, to be like those companies, which is kind of a larger pool, and the companies that aspire to be like them. It's a nice way to sort of do your rollouts. This is kind of the customer base we care about, or that cares about us, and then as we kind of grow that with each level, sort of company progress towards unicorn and hypergrowth.
From your experience, how is incident management different from at large organizations like Facebook, from mid-sized companies or small companies? What is the difference in approach and understanding?
Yeah, so I don't want to speak to all of Facebook. It's a big company, and certainly there's some different permutations of incident management, especially within some of the organizations that practice more sort of aggressive and structured incident management, like the security organizations, right? That's a space that within Facebook practices it in a very kind of structured and controlled way. But across the organization, which is sort of what we build Kintaba's practices off of, there's a sort of common tool set that tracks incidents and makes them available to the entirety of the organization. You can be a new sales hire who's been at the company for one day, and you have 100% visibility into all of the major incidents currently happening, currently planned within the company. And you get that knowledge straight out of the gate through the tools that Facebook provides. And I think that really is sort of the critical piece of the incident practice that the company has. Everything else sort of flows past that, right? The organization is constantly refining how it does postmortems, how it distributes them, how it picks who shows up in those reviews, how it talks about things, how it practices blamelessness, right? But the really core piece, and it sounds really simple, but it's very unique, I think, to companies like this or like Facebook, is just that openness and public availability of information, so that you don't have to send email chains out to the executive team to say, what's going on with this Sev 1? What's going on with this Sev 2? How many do we have right now? It's just right there in a tool. And if you did try to send an email like that, you'd probably get an email right back from whatever engineer you wrote that said, just go to the tool, just go look at it there. And that practice has been around for probably since 2008, 2009, for an awfully long time. And as the company grew, I think I personally wondered if it would break. Would you really be able to keep having this degree of openness as a company becomes, very international, very diverse, very spread out, both in terms of functional work as well as, just where people are. And it's turned out to work really well. It turns out it propagates itself forward. That openness gives people access to the library of how things are done. And you learn how things are done, through pattern matching of how people act on the first incident you watch. And then you get a little bit better. And then eventually when you have to file one, you're better at it. And so it sounds very simple, but that's kind of been the most, I think, impactful part of the tool stack that handles incident management at a company like Facebook, is just aggressive openness across the organization of what's happening and access to the teams that are operating on the ground. I think that gives everyone a much more respectful view into, letting people get their jobs done. It's very similar actually to kind of the revolution that I think project management and task management went through. Maybe I'm going to get the dates wrong here, but maybe like more like 10, 15 years ago, right? Where in the old days at like companies like Microsoft, your tasks were defined, up at this executive level. And you had this waterfall effect and you had everything pre-built and you would Gantt charts and all of these horrible things. And then eventually, as the frontline engineer, you'd get your task and you'd do it and you'd close it out. And nowadays it's all much more open, right? Anyone can file tasks. It just sounds obvious to us today. Of course, you or I can file a task. That would be crazy if you couldn't. I sort of see the same trajectory happening with incident management, and Facebook is just way ahead of the game here, as are some other companies like Google and like Netflix, and I'm sure others who are practicing this. Amazon probably does this really well, although I can't speak to them directly. But that sort of openness really distributes out not just responsibility, which is you're responsible for creating these tasks, and naturally that's part of your job, but the good part of accountability, which is, the person who created that task, who created that incident, who's responding it, should be the person who's accountable to it in a positive way. You trust their account of what happened, not their manager's account based on what they saw from the outside. And it really maps in a core tenet of incident management best practices, which is you trust the person who is within the context of the incident. They are the carrier of the actual learnings. Everyone on the outside has this obscured view, right, of what they knew after the fact. Oh, well, obviously you should have done X. So we should have obviously had the script checked in here, right? But the person who is there can actually provide that contextual information around what systemic thing was in place that allowed me to get into this situation, right? How did I end up here? I didn't come to work today to do a bad job. I came to work today hoping to have a great day at work. And that's what really openness provokes, right? Openness provokes responsibility, accountability, and just trust across the organization. And so when I talk about that tool, that's really what I'm talking about. It's not just a dashboard, right? It's actually this propagation of responsibility across the company.
Yeah, I totally like the idea of, the openness and transparency. Would it also mean that for smaller companies that should be easier to adopt incident management and that notion of transparency?
Yeah, for sure. I actually think smaller organizations probably have far more incidents than they realize, because they're within small companies, they're generally dealt with sort of as ad hoc responses, right, within like their Slack channels or otherwise, and kind of getting into that cadence of, one extra action in Slack, call Kintaba create, so we're talking about this in a tracked space, right? Just implementing that step can create a much more diligent approach to the incidents you're already having, and then help you learn from them. Because in small companies as well, learning tends to be even less about, let's all go read the manuals together, right? It becomes more and more about distribute information through Slack, through email, through other places, and get it read. And I think that's where sort of postmortem culture really flows in, right? Is this other part of the tenets of incident response, right? You've got best practices around openness, best practices around record keeping, and then you've got best practices around learning and distribution.
Well, John, for incident management, it's very important to build a knowledge base of how to deal with typical issues in order to improve the quality of service and reduce the overall cost of support. How can Kintaba help achieve these goals?
Yep. So this is what I was just talking about, right? This is postmortem culture. So this is all about an understanding that when we've had an incident, regardless of how critical, we make sure that we take a moment to write up, as the responder, as the person aware of that context, like I was just talking about, we write that down in a useful way. And in the old days, this might have showed up, in a Slack channel and then disappeared after a couple of seconds because it got pushed away, or it might have shown up in an email chain where you were trying to keep executives up to date. But in the modern world, right, what we call modern incident management and best practices, you're actually adding to a document library where you're tracking all of these learnings, and you're distributing that document as soon as it's written out to everyone who is subscribed, responded to, or otherwise, or anyone who's interested and comes back into the tool, hopefully Kintaba, but whatever tool you're using, and is maybe searching around to understand knowledge better. It really turns out knowledge propagates through companies kind of in this iterative ad hoc way, right? We learn kind of over time by the information we have a moment to read and react to. It's very difficult to say to someone, okay, once a week, I need you to sit down and read like 100 pages about everything that went wrong. It's much better to quickly capture like the essence of what went wrong into a postmortem, even if it's short, and then get that distributed while it's still on everyone's minds. They're much more likely to open it up, read it. And then the learnings can be a set of specific things, right? Here's a set of tasks I went and created as a learnings from this document. But it can also be abstract concepts, right? It can be like, these are major learnings about any deployment of Kubernetes inside of the company going forward. And that kind of knowledge will find its way in front of people who maybe maintain the wiki pages for how to set those things up, who maybe, are about to deploy a personal project that might turn into a bigger project inside of the company. So I think when I think about knowledge basing, and when I think about how incident management does this, it's both the process of making sure you write this thing, and then it's putting them all into one place that again is available to everyone. So, companies today will often kind of try and write up Google Docs and stick them into Google folders, and people will go and look at them, and it doesn't work super well. Those folders tend to end up having ACLs around them, right? Access control lists. Only certain people can get at them. They tend to have really long and complex templates, and no one really wants to go read this whole thing over again. We really encourage that, especially for simple incidents, you just write a quick one. I wrote a blog post recently called the 4-second postmortem. And it's just like, just get something down, because it's so much better to get the essence of what you were going to say into a document versus just never writing it because you're worried about having to go put multiple pages of information together. Especially in this world we're in now, especially in the remote work world, where it's less likely that you're going to just casually talk about the incident in front of a water cooler, in front of at the coffee bar. It's like just we're losing a lot of that kind of social fabric that helped us propagate incident information in a non-structured world. So it's more and more important, I think, to go and get something written down, get it into the document library. And if you can come back to it and update it later, that's fine. If you can't, you've still done better than nothing. And better than nothing, we talk a lot, I think, in this world about, everyone's talking about how do I get 1% better? How do I get 2% better? But the reality is, for a lot of folks, you're going from 0 to 1. And 0 to 1 is an infinite improvement, right? It's anything written down is infinitely better than nothing written down. And so I talk a lot about that too when I tend to talk about Kintaba, is you're getting into the habit of creating knowledge and propagating it into your company. And that has almost an infinite value, even though we're really naturally, what we tend to want to do is say, well, here's the thing I'm already doing. How do I make it slightly better?
Yeah, this is very interesting. But how can incident management be integrated into the product release process?
Yeah, so this isn't actually super well defined. I think as incident management kind of grows as a practice in and of itself, we start to wonder a little bit, where it falls into these categorizations of, is it SRE? Is it wider DevOps? Is it an entire company practice, like sort of task management has become? And I think, the decision about where in your DevOps process that it lands is actually something that companies, I try generally to say we have strong opinions and you should do what we tell you to do. The DevOps process implementation is probably the least well-defined piece of how you implement incident management. And we encourage companies to implement it aggressively around, all the way to the point where you might have a high risk push going on through your CI system. And that should probably automatically file an incident preemptively around, this is a real-time response we need to be aware of as it goes out. But that practice isn't necessarily something that's universal. So I think like that topic alone could probably take an hour or two of me in a room with a bunch of different other folks who are talking about DevOps, and we'd all have differing opinions of it. And so we have not yet kind of come to the point where I say, here is how you perfectly position incident response into DevOps. Normally, we see them kind of running alongside each other. Should something happen in the DevOps process that triggers an incident, you would definitely go and kick off your incident management process with that. But something that I think a lot of folks don't realize about incident management is 90+% of incidents are actually human defined. a unique part about the product itself and the process itself and how it's practiced is it still generally takes a person to say, okay, X number of alerts have happened, like why people are panicking. I'm going to make the call. This is a Sev one, and I'm going to initially own it because I'm making that call. So a lot of DevOps is really how do we automate everything, right? Like how do we automate these pieces? And I think that that's kind of an open question, right? It's like, where do we call signals that should automatically create incidents? Because we don't want to willy-nilly create them, right? We don't just want to create them for no reason or people will stop paying attention to them. But at the same time, we do need to find ways to connect that in. So that's, of all the items I think that we talk about here, that's the most open-ended. That is like, where do these two things come together? And I think we might even see vocabulary over time start to splinter around what is an incident as related to sort of DevOps, and especially around like release processes and stabilization, versus what is high priority critical operations that act like incidents in like other parts of the org.
John, and what is your greatest aspiration where you take Kintaba in the next couple of years?
Yeah, so when we think about company vision, right, Kintaba wants a more resilient world. Like that's actually what we're trying to get to. Ultimately, we want anyone to feel comfortable practicing these types of real-time operations that address critical situations. And it's really well defined in the technology engineering SRE world. So that's certainly where we are today. But when I look at our future, I really think about how are folks across the board implementing Kintaba? How are restaurants doing operations physically with something like Kintaba, right? How are emergency responders using practices like Kintaba to go and be better about how they track and improve themselves? And if I look at any company or any industry, I can almost layer out every single part of it and say, here's where resiliency helps you. Here's where resiliency helps a B2B SaaS company. Here's where resiliency helps an oil pipeline company. Take an item from the news recently. Here's how resiliency, helps governments. Here's how resiliency helps families, at home. I always loved the idea that one day task management will break into, right, family management. How do we do to-do lists and merge them? We're not there yet. But I think resiliency is the same way. This is ultimately a philosophy, and we're creating a product to try and propagate that philosophy. And so I don't think that there's a bound here. I don't think that there's a moment where we say, okay, this industry, we're going to go fix them and that's it. Right? I think this is only interesting as a revolution if it ultimately impacts everyone. And one day, everyone talks about resiliency as a positive thing. And I think we're seeing the indications of it today, and the indications of it are the sort of ripples of the wave coming. And I think when I look at the future, that's what it has to be. Like it's only exciting if it really becomes that. It can't just be an SRE practice. It has to be something that industries care about. And that's really where we want to be. We want to be the platform that resiliency is built on for every industry and every person.
John, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a great pleasure to have you here.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for having me. And certainly for anyone watching, please come check us out. We're at kintaba.com. It's free to sign up, free to try. And for teams of 5 or fewer, we're actually free for life. So please come check us out. And thank you so much, Jenna.